Good evening and welcome. Bonne soirée et bienvenue. My name is Michael Poliwata, and I'm the manager of major gifts and partnerships with the Ottawa Public Library. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. Kwe Kakina. We believe it is important to acknowledge that even as we gather virtually, we are on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. Nous rendons hommage à toutes les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis, leurs aînés, leurs ancêtres, et leurs importantes contributions passées et présentées. We want to thank our partners in organizing this event, the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Tonight, we're pleased to host a conversation with Andrew O'Hagan about his latest acclaimed book, Mayflies, a coming-of-age novel and meditation on life, death, and lifelong friendship. In 2003, Andrew was named one of Granta's best young British novelists. He's the author of the novels Our Fathers and Be Near Me, long listed for the Man Booker Prize. Both of these titles are available at the library if you want to check them out. Before I turn the page to Sean, I'd like to remind you about an OPL program tomorrow at noon, a bicycle workshop to help you discover some of Ottawa's most interesting destinations that are easily accessible by bike. Heritage sites, nature areas, and public art are only a few of the destinations to find out about. Remember that you can visit the OPL website anytime to learn about an amazing variety of programs and to access the vast and wonderful collection available with your library card. It is now my great pleasure to introduce a great friend of the Ottawa Public Library, Sean Wilson, Artistic Director of the Ottawa International Writers Festival, to say a few words. Thank you and have a great evening. Merci et bonne soirée.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening, everyone. I'm also broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you all to the Writers Festival's 2021 virtual season, to thank our friends at the Ottawa Public Library for their ongoing collaboration, and to thank the Scottish Society of Ottawa for their partnership presenting tonight's event. I also want to thank you for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, but I know that wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookstore nearby that would be more than happy to sell you some great books. Our spring season continues for another few weeks, and it's all available online, free and on demand at writersfestival.org. If you enjoy this event or any of our virtual programming, please consider making a charitable donation. Your financial support will allow us to continue to bring you the world's most interesting authors and thinkers, even as we continue into year 2 of the pandemic. Our host tonight, John Ivison, is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the National Post and the author of the nonfiction book, Trudeau, The Education of a Prime Minister, and more recently a novel, The Riotous Passion of Robbie Burns, and we look forward to welcoming him back to our virtual stage on June 17th to talk more about Robbie Burns alongside Dr. Pauline McKay, author of Burns for Every Day of the Year, for another presentation presented with the Scottish Society of Ottawa and the Ottawa Public Library. But for now, let's give a warm Ottawa welcome to our host, John Ivison.
Hello there, everybody, and good evening. And Andrew O'Hagan, who I think is in London, correct me if I'm wrong, a warm welcome to Canada's capital. Cheers, a glass of, it's not of Glenmorangie, which I think was the drink of choice of your main character in the book, but in honor of the book's hero, Tully Dawson, for ease of translation, anybody watching might want to fill their own glasses. So, slàinte mhath.
Slàinte mhath.
So, Andrew, if we could just start with Mayflies, which I thoroughly enjoyed. It's a good read. Anybody who's not who's watching and hasn't read it, take a look. It is set in the summer of 1986 in Ayrshire, as two friends, Tully Dawson and the narrator Jimmy Collins, bond over films and music and being kings of the world, or at least Irvin Newtown. 30 years later, Tully calls with devastating news that leads to a retrospective of the friendship, and the title refers to the brevity of youth and human existence. And Andrew, could I ask?
It's kind of a bit frozen there, John.
Could you hear me?
I just missed the end of your question there, John. Could you do it again?
Yeah, so I was just saying, I wondered if you could give a brief reading of a part of the book to give people a flavor of what it's all about.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, John. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I mean, to have a bondsman and a man of journalism in my corner tonight is such a pleasure. And what I wanted to do was just read from the very center of the book, which is when the boys, these boys who out of the west coast of Scotland have driven with their lack of money and their great enthusiasm down to Manchester for the 10th anniversary of punk. What they do is they finally get into a hall where the great event itself is happening. I'm going to read a couple of pages just from that very point in the book. Then the Smiths came on. Aubrey Beardsley in white jeans, Morrissey in his prime. The singer wafted into view and sowed his drowsy reticence like a drug. The band was at its height, romantic and wronged and fierce and sublime, with haircuts like agendas. Morrissey came brandishing a license, a whole manner of permission, as if a new kind of belonging could be made from these feelings of being left out, like nobody knew you as he did. Time takes nothing away from it. Those thousands of heartened teenagers taking the roof off and giving out to a gawky frontman from Stretford. Tully found me and pushed me down to the stage. Over the speakers, the sound was scratchy, but every word and every guitar lick felt like a statement only they could make and only we could hear. Those songs rolling from the stage to irrigate our lives. That's what it's all about, said Tully. And he kissed my cheek as we sang. I could see Limbo at the very front, whirling out of his skin, holding up a smoke and shouting about panic on the streets of Carlisle. Then he was near us and wagging his finger in time to the music, a wonderful look on his face. Singing about a vicar, about Joan of Arc and throwing plastic tumblers into the air. Our hair was soaking wet. The Ayrshire boys appeared from all corners of the hall and we hugged and the music soared and it seemed like a huge animation of the things that mattered to us then. Tibbs and Hogg, Limbo and Tully and Clogs, the full brass of being. Who knew what time incubated or what time would demonstrate? We were there, beyond navigation, floating through the air. We beamed to the rafters and jumped shoulder to shoulder, and the words we sang were daft and romantic and ripe and British. Custom built for the clear-eyed young. They say, you know nothing at 18, but there are things you know at 18 that you will never know again. Morrissey would lose his youth, and not only his youth, but the gusto that took him across the stage with a banner saying the Queen is dead is a thing of permanence. We didn't know it then, but it was also for all of us a tender goodbye. And we would never be those people again. Check Limbo, Tully said in my ear. And I looked to the edge of the stage where the boy himself was spread over a speaker, climbing. Nobody at that age needs more than what Limbo McCafferty had in abundance. He had vitality. He had the spirit of resistance in that single moment. and as the final encore bristled and rose to perfect confusion, Limbo appeared on the stage, going past crewmen and bouncers to take up residence by the drums, dancing and smiling for eternity. The crowd cheering him on and spiriting the light in his direction.
Magical stuff. It's like being there. Thank you very much for that. Just so folks watching, you're going to be able to put your own questions to Andrew via Zoom or Facebook. I'll tell you how in a little while, but first I'm going to ask some questions about the things that I'm curious about. There seems to be, Andrew, a great explosion at the moment of Scottish auto fiction. I think obviously Douglas Stewart's Shuggie McBain, but this one from you as well. I mean, you've said this is your most personal novel yet, and I'd imagine anybody who's read it would want to know how much of it is biographical.
Oh, completely, John. You know, once in a while in an author's life, there is a complete effusion of autobiographical energy. And for me, it was very natural with this book that it would be an autobiographical fiction, that it would carry, if you like, the energy of youth and of my own life somehow right into the, you know, hearts of the readers. That this was a book about the life I knew. It was a book about experiences that we'd had, and somehow the truth of the book, the validity of the book, if you like, was from life. And, you know, I've written a number of novels before, but with this one, you know, it just felt like a complete territory that was familiar to me, do you know? I mean, that sometimes happens, and this was the one.
But so you said that some books go to the center of an author's questions, and that is, this book is that for me. What were the questions and what were the answers?
Well, the answers will be in the mind of the audience. I think the readers, and I've been overwhelmed, I have to tell you, John, I've been overwhelmed by the response to this book internationally. I mean, all over the world, people have been responding to this book. It's a book about male friendship, about loyalty and commitment, and about what friendship means over the course of a life. You know, we all have friends when we're young, and they come and go a bit. But sometimes the lastingness, the endurability of those friendships becomes a big deal in our sense of what life is. You know, we look to those friends to give us courage. Their commitment, in a sense, gives us permission about how to live our lives. And Mayflies is a book about that, that in some sense, you know, it raised questions about whether when the childhood's over, is the friendship over? Or years later, in the second half of the book, when that central friendship between Tully and Jimmy becomes ripe, Tully needs something from Jimmy. He needs an expression of friendship and commitment that maybe they'd never prepared for. And that is life itself. That's life saying, actually, do you know what? Friendship is a thing beyond anything we ever expected.
Was there a friend in your life who was the life and soul, who went through what Tully went through?
There was, John. I mean, and no doubt about it. I mean, this I've always declared is such a clearly autobiographical book. And my great friend from childhood, Keith Martin, who was that guy, you know, he was the lead singer in the band. He was the guy with the greatest looks, you know, the best record collection, the highest cheekbones, you know, the absolute sort of leader when it came to imagining what life could be. You know, when you're young, you know, you're always looking for approval, I think. You're always looking for somebody to give you permission. We forget about all that when we're older. I mean, you know, I'm in my 50s now. But when it started, you know, we were all looking for that guy, the exemplar. And Keith Martin, who became Tully Dawson in my novel, was the exemplar. You know, he was that guy who, he was more political, he was more engaged, He was more of the front man, and he had the better haircut than anybody else.
But
So-
but you went on to a stellar career. You left Ayrshire. It sounds like the Tully character stayed in Ayrshire. Was there a sense of guilt that you had about leaving the Ayrshire boys behind?
I think it's a brilliant question, that, John, because, I think we always have a sense of guilt about growth. It brings with it a sense of consequences, and that we've left people behind who were probably, in some cases, the best people we ever met. We have this myth of progress, that we're always moving forward towards better things, towards riper life, towards deeper significance. But actually, what if the best people we ever met were the people we met when we were 12? What about that as a proposition? What if our families, the people we grew up with, much resented, much left, much questioned, were actually, in some sense, the sharpest people we would ever meet? And it's an unpopular view of life, but I try to reintroduce it in this novel, that, there's this wonderful sense of progress that we all adhere to. We're always moving forward, we're always growing, we're always getting bigger. But what if we're not really getting bigger? What if we're, in a sense, leaving something, losing something, and life is an account of loss as well as achievement?
I actually felt kind of similar, that it was a good preparation for life. The banter and knockabout stuff in the west of Scotland. And they're very sharp characters, because you had to be.
Well, you did. Some people have said to me, oh, these guys seem a bit unusually kind of aware of the culture of music and film and books. And I have to correct them every time and say, that's what they were like.
Right.
If anything, I slightly took it down in the book. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like the sharpest people I ever met. And I'm somebody who lives in literary London, and and spends a lot of time here in New York, where I publish in the New York Review of Books and the London Review of Books. And I meet a lot of sharp people, and people who are utterly on top of their material. But I still think that some of the natively and instinctively sharpest people I met were the people I met at school. Pals I had who were into bands and who were into their look and who were into politics in a particular way in the 1980s. And I'm not romanticizing it, because of course there were some idiots as well, and some people who were, completely out of step with that period. But I do maintain that sometimes the people from your past who are in your language, who are under your skin, who are inside your heart, who are part of the very material of your existence in an earlier way, that those people are the smartest people that you ever met.
There's a lot in the book that resonates with me. Brookside, the Smiths, was Kenny Dalglish's goal against Bruges in 1978, one of his top three, which it
Do you
wasn't.
remember that?
Which it wasn't, by the way. But but did you worry that the kind of babble that amused young men in the 1980s might not translate to a broader audience?
Never for a second, because the thing that translates, whether it be from Greek tragedy or the 19th century novel, or the 1950s novel in Canada, or movies in the 1980s in Europe and America and Canada and the UK, what translates is a sense of common humanness. It really does. We could be mentioning, you could talk to me now with great enthusiasm about the Raptors and about things that are happening in Canada. And if it was presented in the right way, it would be like my enthusiasms. It would be like the places I had been, the journeys I had gone on, and the shared experience with my father or friends. I don't think that cultural references alienate people. I think they bring us in, not only because of the international nature of popular culture now, although that is a thing, but just because when you write well, John, this, when you write well about a thing, you're inviting my communion into it internationally. I mean, we make a great deal about our boundaries and our borders and our differences and our nationalities. But actually, do you know what? We're just human beings.
Well, one universal truth which you hit upon was that people in their 50s are still listening to music that they started listening to 40 years ago.
Yeah, of course.
You write, it's always a struggle to reach the future. It seemed to me that the book is, it's not sentimental, but it is nostalgic about being at the pinnacle of youth. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, I think it's fair. I mean, I think that everybody understands that if only in retrospect, if only years later, we all sit back with our children in bed and our wives, our husbands, our partners beside us and realize that there was a moment that turned out to be the pinnacle of our youth. We didn't know it was, of course. You were just passing through some club or some city or some relationship or some street, but you were at the height of your youth then. And everybody knows that, looking back. And that is why fiction is such a sort of brilliant little moral machine in your life, I would argue, is because it provides you with that little evidence, that little text, that little thing that helps you understand your life. When the great writers that I grew up admiring, they gave you that, they gave you the arithmetic, they gave you the book that allowed you to deepen your life, to understand where you'd been. In a sense, yeah, the past and nostalgia is part of the picture, you know. I mean, I didn't set out to write a book about the past or about nostalgia. I set out to write a book about love and commitment and the deep bonds that exist between human beings who I had known. And I think that becomes international very quickly, as it has proved to be with mayflies, you know, that before you know it, you're actually addressing everybody, because we've all had this experience of having somebody who made your life make sense to you at a young age, you know, and you never forget them. You leave them behind and you go on and you find bigger projects and bigger truths, but you never forget those people who gave you the fundamentals.
Well, another universal truth you hit upon is mortality. And of Tully, the narrator says he struggled to accept his friend was no longer 20, because him not being 20 means none of us are 20, and him dying means we all are. Did your friend's struggle cause you to reflect on your own mortality?
All of it, you know, yeah. I mean, everything that happened to him, John, was a kind of trigger for all of us to reflect on our own mortality. You know, that's what happens in life. I mean, in 50 years, neither you nor me nor any of the people attending to this broadcast now will be alive, really. And that's just a fact, and it's just a fact that we need to learn to live around. There's truth in it, and there's difficulty in it, and there's pain in it, but there's also a kind of acceptance. And what he brought to us, both Keith, the real life protagonist, who inspired the book, but also Tully in the book, it's just, by the end of this book, you accept that we're all, in a sense, on a short fuse. We're all on our way out. But while we're here, how we can burn, how he burned. He burned with life, with prospects, with possibilities, with potentials, with views, with opinions, with prejudices, with loves, with lusts. He burned. And it's the burn in the midst of our own lives, I think, that we want to attend to. It helps us. I don't know, I mean, Wallace Stevens, the great American poet of the 1930s, once said that the thing about literature is that it helps you to live your life. I believe that.
You concluded by saying that Tully had a champion smile. That's one of the last lines in the book, on his face again. You know, for a book that ends with a death, it doesn't leave the reader melancholic. Rather, it's kind of bittersweet, tinged with hope. I guess the hope that Morris's line that there is a light that never goes out.
Yes.
I mean, do you see it as an optimistic book?
It's the most optimistic book I'll ever write. I mean, in that sense, there is a light that never goes out. if we don't believe that, we don't believe that our lives are worth anything. We're not just here in order to please our neighbours or satisfy our husbands, or not disappoint our wives, or support our children. There's something deeper altogether. I mean, these things are important, but there's something deeper, which is about how do we actually honour the opportunity of life itself. And that's what the book's about. That's what Mayflies is. There is a light that never goes out. A young man can be taken from the world before his time, but what he leaves behind is an absolute mark, a mark on the page, a mark in life, a sense of having changed people's destiny, people's sense of what life's glory and honor was. And for me, without a great deal of effort, I have to say that feels natural to me. That's the purpose of life. He left something behind that is indelible. He thought he was just an ordinary guy. My pal who inspired the book, Keith, he was a teacher in Glasgow. Glasgow's not the centre of the world. Being a teacher's not the centre of the world. But he, in some sense, carried the whole business of being the centre of other people's hopes. And for me, if you don't believe in that, then you don't really believe in human potential. And I love all that.
Yeah, well, you captured that very well. Just on a political issue, you obviously central to the book is the concept of assisted dying, which has been a big political issue in Canada. It's now legal. Was that something you grappled with, or?
Oh, hugely. I mean, John, I have to say that the issue of assisted dying seems to me that one of the great frontiers of liberty. If you're going to be a civilized society, if you're going to be a thinking person, what you're going to do is you're going to support the idea that when people have a diagnosed illness where they're going to die soon and possibly in pain and in difficulty, then what you do is you assist them towards a reasonable death. Here in Scotland, what we do is campaign endlessly that we be one of those nations, that we have that enlightenment that you've been speaking about in Canada, and that exists in Switzerland, in Belgium, and in New Zealand, and other enlightened countries with a real sense of philosophical enlightenment. What they do is they look at life. They don't just get mangled in policy and endless news cycles. What they do is they look at the business of life itself. What is it to be a human being in a society with certain challenges? The biggest challenge being death itself, the one guarantee, the one absolute prospect that we can all depend on. And so we look at that and we say, how do we take people out of the world who are terminally ill in a way that is rational, merciful, forgiving? And it seems to me that in that context, not having assisted dying is a barbarity. So I look to my government in Scotland now and say, please see that.
I was going to ask you, I'm surprised that it's not an issue for the Sturgeon government. Have they?
Well, the Sturgeon government, I can tell you, is bringing it forth as a bill imminently. And I've been active in trying to persuade the undecideds that this will be a huge step, I think, much bigger than so many of the issues that preoccupy us all the time, because birth and life and death, there's three things. I know there's endless subtleties. I know there's endless questions in between, but the end of life is something we all will face. There's no dubiety about that. And I encourage the Scottish government and Nicola Sturgeon and all the MPs who find themselves undecided, and the majority of MPs in Scotland now, it would appear, are decided that they're in favour of a humane, assisted effort on behalf of people who are terminally ill. And for me, that is a great achievement, and I will continue to work on its behalf.
All right. I'm just going to remind people, if you want to leave a question, a comment on Facebook, or ask your question via the Q&A button on Zoom, I will then ask them to Andrew. if I can figure out how the Q&A button works. Apparently it's down here somewhere. I'm just going to press it and see if anything's happened. Nothing. So anybody wants to ask a question, please do. So just moving on from mayflies, because you've written non-fiction, you've written fiction, various projects around the world. The Satoshi affair, about the claim that programmer Craig Wright was Bitcoin founder Satoshi Nakamoto. And then in 2017, The Secret Life, 3 true stories about helping Julian Assange write his memoirs.
Yeah.
What drew you to those subjects?
You know, I've always been interested, John, in people who are, if you like, on the cusp of modern life, and carrying all its energies and difficulties and confusions. I think as a non-fiction writer, that's always been a completely natural interest of mine. You know, I don't know if you feel that as a journalist yourself, but sometimes you're just overwhelmed by the sense that your job fundamentally is to describe society as it is. And I was invited by each of those people that you've spoken about, Julian Assange in the first place, to write about him and to help him with his memoirs. He was under house arrest then in Norfolk in East Anglia in England. And then later by Craig Wright, another Australian, these are 2 Australians in a row, to help him define his project as the inventor, he said, of Bitcoin, the great cryptocurrency that would change the financial world. I've been approached by these people, I mean, serially, actually, over the last 10 or 15 years. And my response always is, anything that's interesting to the world is interesting to me. I mean, my job is to try and, whether as a novelist, as we've been discussing, but also as a non-fiction writer, to try and sort of set fire to those big moral subjects that really, if you like, enrich our lives. So that's a big project, obviously, and I put it very starkly to you. But what I'd say is, you know, we're in the business of, as journalists and as novelists, of trying to sort of enrich reality for people, and those subjects were absolute gifts to me somehow.
And they both, I guess, revolve around the digital world and destabilizing the way things have been done up until now. I mean, were these, I guess they were interesting characters to talk to.
They were endlessly. I mean, wouldn't you find it to be the case? I mean, talking to Julian Assange for a year. I guess it was a gift. You know, they never disappointed me. I mean, I'm probably disappointed them, to be honest, because of course people have a sense of public relations and how they want to be perceived. But I'm an old-fashioned writer in one sense, and that I want to. I mean, I'm on the side of the reader, not on the side of the subject. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine that made you a welcome biographer.
No, I think I'm a nightmare biographer myself.
Going back to Scotland and discuss something else you were involved in, which was in 2008, a night out with Robert Burns.
Oh, yeah.
The greatest poems, and I think it was around the time of his bicentennial, right? The 200th anniversary of his birth. In the introduction, you talk about how the sting has been taken out of Burns, the political message diluted or erased, the power of the poetry and its relevance to modern times diminished, and the annual celebration has become pantomimic. Do you think there's I mean, even in Canada, the cult of Burns has grown proportionately, seems to me, with the decline in the understanding of what he was all about. Is that a concern?
Well, I know it's been a concern for a number of us, and you included, you know, trying to enrich the sense of Burns as a writer primarily, not as a, you know, cultural icon who just symbolizes Scottishness or, you know, Burns night, or, you know, a celebration of drink and, you know, excess. Burns is primarily a writer. You know, what he is a constructor of brilliant images within his poems, and And I've always tried to support that, you know, as a broadcaster and as a writer. And as you mentioned, A Night Out with Robert Burns, that was a book that I wrote, you know, with commentary on the best of the poems as I saw them, that would be delivered to every single school in Scotland as a way of encouraging young people to appreciate the genius of this poet. We have a poet, Robert Burns, who is internationally celebrated. I mean, apart from Shakespeare, there is no poet who has a day of the year dedicated to him. Burns Night, the 25th of January, every year, celebrated all over the world. And I'm a ready participant in any celebration, a great reciter and lover of Robert Burns. But as you know, John, that can be mislaid slightly. And people can suddenly think that Burns is just all about the happiness of Scotland and the wonderfulness of being a Scottish person. He wasn't about that at all. He was questioning his society endlessly, the church, the state, the government, you know, the difference between rich and poor, you know, the difference between sexual and gender identities. He was a complete genius of difficult questions. And so should all writers be in some sense. Why pick up a writer who just reassures you? Writers question you and cause you to, in a sense, grow as a person. And I think that that was Robert Burns's instinct, don't you think?
Well, he didn't make life easy for himself, that's for sure. You know, criticizing the
And
government while
possibly
being
not
an
for anybody
employee.
else either.
You talk about the celebrations and being involved in them. The introduction offers a kind of delicious account of the bicentennial Burns supper at Kilwinning Mother Lodge. Well, Kilwinning's being your hometown in Ayrshire, right? And it's, you say, where just about everybody there spoke in the accent that Burns would have spoken in. The poems, the poetry just tripped out of them. The songs turned over in their mouths like soft potatoes, which
Well,
I thought was a beautiful description. I
just love that kind of native sense of a poet's language, you know, that it's not just messages. This is the thing, John, you know, I don't believe writers are editorialists. I don't think that Margaret Atwood or Alice Munro or, you know, Ernest Hemingway or William Shakespeare or, you know, I don't think any of them are about writing editorials, telling people what to think and delivering them with certainties and absolutes about what life is like. They offer possibilities. They offer arithmetic that other people can solve. They say 2 + 2, and the reader says 4. You know, that's the business. And Robert Burns is no different in that way. He described the world that he knew, a hurly-burly, a tremendous, you know, world of fellowship and love. You know, when Chapman Billies leave the street and Ruthie neighbours meet, as market days are weird and late and folk begin to tack the gate, you know, he had a great rhythm, absolute certainty about the work itself, about the language. He didn't have a moral scheme or agenda on people internationally. And I resist the idea that he's like a messenger for this or that political point of view. He's a messenger for human life, beat by beat, day by day, moment by moment. And that's what I argue for.
You, at the toast you gave, you talk about the celebration of wit and sentiment, of sociability and the humor of the poems. That was a strong feeling to you. And as you toasted this town of mine, and the complicated memory of Robert Burns, I mean, that sounds as deeply core and personal to you as parts of Mayflies.
Oh, totally. I mean, totally. I mean, I look at a great canonical historical writer like Robert Burns as a kind of father, really, an exemplar, a person who gave me permission to write about my local humanity in the language of a universal. So here we are talking across the ocean tonight about a book written about a bunch of boys in Ayrshire, Scotland, in the West Coast, in the 1980s, and what happened to them 30 years later when a call comes that calls on their commitment to each other. I mean, people all over the world know that narrative. We have all lived that narrative, or we all will in time. Our parents will die, our friends will be removed, sometimes before us. And what we do is we try and understand life. And the idea that, you know, I mean, a poet like Robert Burns would be a parochial poet, would be a guy from Ayrshire in Scotland who had no relevance. He's celebrated in Vladivostok.
Yeah, there are more statues to him than anybody else but Queen Victoria and Christopher Columbus.
There you go. There you go. You know, he's understood in places where they have never heard of some of the values of our societies. And that is a writer of international standing. That's a writer, as it were, turning the beautiful internal life of human beings all over the world. And Christ Almighty, is that not what we talk about when we talk about literature?
Absolutely. Well, I've hogged a lot of your time, Andrew. I've got people lining up here, and if I can figure out how to make them their questions appear. Okay, here we go. I don't think you need to read anything. I think you just respond. So Kevin Burns, there you go. He must be probably hails from
a relative.
Probably hails from Ayrshire. He asks, one of the great tensions in male relationships is their ambiguity. They are fierce and loyal, but the fear of possibility of entering gay territory complicates things. What are your thoughts about that?
That's a good question, a fantastic question, actually, because it absolutely directly addresses our times, I think. You know, there was never a moment in the past when that wouldn't have been a complicating factor, you know, that, you know, men in Scotland in a working class environment adoring each other or emulating each other wouldn't have been sort of like suspect or difficult. It was never in our childhood, I have to tell you. We never felt, the boys that I grew up with, that sexuality or sexual attraction was an issue. But I was delighted in later generations when things opened up and, you know, as it were, you know, gay life and transgender life and gender non-specific life became a kind of much more of a kind of discussable and easy subject in the culture. I just was relieved by that because, in a sense, we were all in love as teenagers. It's just that we were platonic lovers, you know. Love between men could never be described. My father, for example, could never hug another man. I mean, it just wasn't a thing.
No.
So I was relieved when all those changes I've tried to describe there came about, because it just felt natural to me. You know, the boys that I hung out with when I was a teenager were largely you know, heterosexual, but it hardly mattered because the love affairs were as deep as any love. It's just that they didn't involve sex, but you know, that was fine.
Next question from an anonymous attendee. That line about knowing things at 18 that you will never know again really resonates. Do you think that understanding is something we should keep in mind when looking at kids today?
I really do. You know, I mean, I say that as a father of a 17-year-old, you know, the idea that, you know, we are the great fonts of wisdom, you know, that we in our grey-hairedness and our reading, you know, 5 minutes ago, I was the youngest person in London. You know, it felt like that. And people used to say that to me. And suddenly, it's just another middle-aged or older guy. And I say to my child, you know, you can take what I say or not take it, and probably not taking it shows more originality on your part. You know, I don't think that age brings wisdom. I wrote that line. There are things you know at 18 that you will never know again. People say you know nothing at 18, but there are things you know then that you will never know again. I really believe that. You just know a certain relationship to your fellows, to your girls, to the world that is there and explicit and has arrived and is ripe and is complete and in your head that will never come again. And that's one of the things we should recognize about life, is that we're not in some trajectory towards wisdom. You know, sometimes we're moving away from wisdom. That's the glory of life.
I'm sure that's what your kids would say. That's what mine say for sure.
They're always telling me.
Heather Theoret asks a question from Mr. O'Hagan. If you didn't write, what would you be doing with your life?
That's a completely brilliant question, because I mean, if the universe was free and equal, and you know, it was an equal opportunities existence, I would be a dancer. I've always loved dancing. I was a teenage ballet dancer, believe it or not. I came out of my working class community in the west coast of Scotland, desperate to dance, and my father was horrified. Can you imagine? And my mother wasn't best pleased either. But I thought it was a kind of way of expressing all the energy of change and difference. And I don't know, I mean, I can't explain it to you. I mean, dance was my absolute first instinct.
Did you follow that? Did you train at all, or?
Yeah, I went to Scottish Ballet when I was, you know, at 10, 11, 12, and trained properly. Wow. And thought, this is the deliverance. This is the way out of a, I mean, when Billy Elliot, the movie, appeared, I thought it was a complete rip-off. And I said to Lee Hall when I met him, who wrote that wonderful piece, first as stage play and then as a movie. And I said to Lee, you know, you've completely nicked my life. You know, I grew up in a housing estate, post-industrial, you know, post-mining town, wanted to be the most unacceptable and sexually unacceptable and physically unacceptable thing, which is to be a dancer. But it was where all my energy was at that age. So I have to honestly answer the questioner and say that had I not been a writer, that's the thing I would have most wanted to be.
Well, another anonymous attendee asks, how different is the Scotland of today from the Scotland of your youth?
Another brilliant question, really. The Scotland of my youth was a place dominated by a sense of Thatcherism. I don't know how many of the attendees tonight will remember how in these islands, you know, here in the UK, it was dominated by a sense of monetarism and Thatcherism, and that poverty was a kind of disgrace, and that socialism was the enemy, and the idea that you could live decently in a working class culture, that was decimated by the Thatcher years. You know, The Boys and Mayflies, this novel that we've been discussing, they collected, as we did, this was completely autobiographical, they collected tins and groceries for the wives and the miners who were on strike during the Great British Miners' Strike of 1984-85. During that winter, that's what we did. And it's there in the novel and in our lives, very particularly, because we felt that Thatcher, she entered, can I just say, an element of spite. I don't know if this is a thing that you think about in Canada, but it was certainly a thing that has dominated our sense of history, social history, here in the UK, is that Thatcher, for all her supposed achievements, she entered an element of human spite and recklessness and denunciation and class separation into our lives, which was hated and resented by us and is by the boys in this book. And that's changed somewhat in that now I think there's a generation coming through who are absolutely determined to change the world, whether it be an international response to do with Black Lives Matter or Me Too, or they just aren't going to live the old life. They're not going to do it. And I look at my daughter and I look at young friends and I think, good on you. We were probably too tolerant. We didn't want to actually devastate the world in order to remake it. But I think they look at it, and sometimes they don't see the complications, and sometimes they're naive about it, but their fundamental energy is admirable, which is to say, let's take the world apart and do it again.
Aisha from Montreal asks, when you spoke about universality, do you think that it could apply across generations, meaning that kids today could connect to the kids from the 80s? Well, you've just touched on some of that, I guess.
Of course. I mean, John, the thing is, it's a joke, really. I mean, we think the 80s is like miles ago, and it's one of the indulgences of youth. But in the great scheme of things, the 80s is a fraction of a second ago. Anybody who's really interested in, the history of the universe, to raise a big subject, and we must consider that if we're really interested in who we are and what we've done and why we're here. 5 million years ago is a blink in human existence, and yet we make a fuss about people who are 20 years older than us. It's nothing. We're living in exactly the same period of human development, and we must attend to the changes in our own small pocket. But actually, it's nothing.
Although I've got 2017 and 2, not very good planning on my part. But the older ones are very different from the way we were, in that they're much better behaved for a start. I mean, in the book you talk about going out and getting blutered. Well, they don't seem to go out and get blutered. They're far more health conscious. They're far more conscious of the planet. They're far more conscious of not careerism, but they're just, I think, more aware. No?
Well, they probably are in a good way. I mean, it was interesting to notice that the UK Prime Minister the other day got married to her husband, the UK Prime Minister, wearing a recyclable dress. I thought that was quite millennial, but also a complete indication of how the generation just behind me think. They want the world to be slightly better, recyclable, less wasteful, and they expect people like us, I guess, to be ultra aware of the wastefulness and the sort of political mindlessness that we took for granted growing up. That seems to me a good thing. I mean, I'm not into political correctness, cancelling and excess, but I am into heightened awareness. What novelist isn't?
Right. Right.
It seems to me a no-brainer. There's not a big argument here between generations. There's an argument between people who are thoughtful and people who are not. And that's not even defined by national cultures. Or it's the same in the UK as it is in Canada. It's the same as it is in the US, as it is in Australia. You're either thinking about how to live a bit better, and these younger generations have come up with some fantastically compelling ideas and compulsions. And you ought to take time to really honor that, I think.
Let's end on a little lighter note. Did you ever actually make a Jukebox 50?
Yes, I did.
Give me a quick sample.
Oh my God. I wish we were doing this conversation just up the road where my cafe is. In the novel, Mayflies, it's described that the main character asks Jimmy, the narrator, to help him through his last months. And one of the things that Jimmy comes up with is that Tully would produce his festive 50, his top 50. There used to be a thing, some of you will remember this, there used to be a thing in John Peel, the great, legendary, lovely, absolutely adorable Radio 1 DJ. He used to have a festive 50 every Christmas, the best 50 independent and interesting records of the year. And I decided that I would ask Keith, my dying friend, if he'd come up with his festive 50 of all time, and he did. And I put it into the jukebox at the cafe, which is just up the road from where I'm talking to you now in Primrose Hill in North London. I wish I could play your track to just see you out tonight, but it was full of.
If you could, what would you play?
Oh, you know, it was the Smiths, it was New Order, it was Joy Division, it was Echo and the Bunnymen, it was Altered Images, it was Orange Juice, it was all those great bands of Scotland. They used to call them the sound of young Scotland, which I think is a kind of almost invisible anthem to my book, Mayflies. The sound of young Scotland, you know, Orange Juice, the Fire Engines, Aztec Camera, all those great bands, the Jesus and Mary Chain, you know, they're all on the jukebox. So if any of you feel like coming over here, I'm going to press a few numbers for you.
Primrose Hill.
Primrose Hill.
Great.
Sam's
Well,
Cafe.
Andrew, it's been an absolute privilege chatting to you, and on behalf of the Ottawa International Writers Festival, the Ottawa Public Library, and everybody watching, thank you very much. You've produced yet another great book. Thank you.
What a pleasure. Thank you, Ottawa. I send you a huge kiss. Lots of love.